On this there has been an ongoing debate for years about whether the United States' support to Israel over the past several decades is due to Israel being a strategic asset to the US, or whether this support is primarily the power of organized groups or lobbies, as they are sometimes called, that work regularly to influence the position of successive American administrations towards Israel and in its favor. As for the first position, that Israel constitutes a strategic asset to the United States, or in less abstract formulations, that Israel is the spearhead of the United States in the Middle East, it appears at the first glance that it is easier to reach as a conclusion without any knowledge or insight on the topic by what is known as the man of the street or women of the street, since it might be said that it is unreasonable to lavish all this financial and military support on Israel without having a major interest for the United States in this. However, on the other hand, it is also possible, with the same degree of ease and lack of information, to reach to an opposite conclusion, which is that the global Zionist movement is behind this support, and based on what it is said about us, Arabs, that we are inclined towards the conspiracy theory in explaining political events. That is, that there is a Zionist conspiracy seeking to control or has controlled for the political decision in the US. We have seen examples on this type of interpretation in the Arab uprising that has begun in Tunisia at the end of 2010, then in Egypt on January 25th, 2011 and beyond. Sometimes we find that this type of interpretation, not only among the man of the street, but also among students preparing for their doctorates at Birzeit University and in discussions with each other about the Arab revolutions and uprisings. I will not approach the subject from this perspective or the perspective of these two approaches because, as I have formulated them, they are below the level of criticism. I will focus on the factors and the types of data necessary to write about the topic to support either position, and the methodological problems that accompany this type of discussion. In some cases, as I will argue, the two factors come together, the convergence of interests in a number of aspects and the diversions of strategic interests as well. I will conclude my talk by giving you bad news related to this topic, for which I apologize in advance. I will begin with the point of view that sees Israel as a strategic interest, pointing out only a number of historic changes that can be used to support this viewpoint. And very briefly, I will begin. This is a strategic interest. I will begin with a Balfour Declaration, as it is known in English, which has, as you know, promised the Zionist movement of a national home for the Jews in Israel, in Palestine. Also, at the end of the World War I, Britain and its allies were in the process of dividing the lands of the Ottoman Empire. Britain saw in this national home a base or an area of influence in the Middle East. It was clear that the phrase national home could ultimately mean a state, especially that Britain, since Britain would have had a mandate in Palestine after the end of the war. The US has supported then this promise. Here, it is clear that the establishment of the State of Israel was a strategic interest for Britain, and perhaps also to the United States. The Zionist movement knew since the beginning that as a colonial settlement movement in a land that was not its own, it would be in a hostile environment, especially after the Nakba, but also before that. Thus, Jablonski's idea of the need for an iron wall as a barrier to the indigenous people and others, and this was, he wrote about this in 1923, before Israel was established. So this policy of iron wall will remain. And here I would like to refer and say that Netanyahu has indicated in a speech in July 23, mentioning Jablonski by name. The idea of the iron wall has been translated in several ways, including initiating war with enemies whenever an opportunity arises, or finding an opportunity, as happened in the 1967 war, when Israel claimed that the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping by Egypt was tantamount to a declaration of war on it. This was preceded by the Zionist movement, having moved the center of gravity of its work from Britain to the United States at the end of World War II, after it had become clear that Great Britain was on the decline as a superpower and that the US had become the first country in the West in terms of its economic, technological, and military capabilities. In the midst of the conflict between the Eastern and Western camps during the Cold War, it can be said that Israel's alliance with the US and the Western camp in general was a strategic alliance. This situation remained as is until the conclusion of a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt during the Sadat era. Although the Six-Day War was primarily an Israeli interest, it was also an American interest. The United States continued and for Israel to be an extremely important strategic asset. And I repeat, for Israel, but the opposite is not true. Israel's strategic importance gradually diminished from the perspective of the US in the 70s and 80s of the last century, and from there until today. As for the point of view that does not see support for Israel as a strategic asset, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would like to point out, first of all, that it is true that Israel continued to provide a number of services to the US, including, but not limited to, various intelligence information, not only about Arab countries, but also about other countries, not necessarily in the Middle East. But we have also witnessed a strategic conflict of interests to one way or another among the Waidefer, for example, and of course, 2-3 examples. The first Intifada. After several years had passed since the first Intifada and Israel was unable to completely suppress it, the Bush administration decided to seek a negotiated political solution in order to preserve the stability of the Arab regimes loyal to it, as it was a model for their peoples who sympathized with them. And given that the Palestinian Intifada constituted an element of instability in the region, this goal, i.e. the stability of the Arab regimes loyal to the US, constituted a strategic interest to the US. The Israeli government strongly refused to negotiate in principle with any Palestinian side that represents the PLO, including any Palestinian, independent Palestinian delegation in any negotiations. So at the beginning, there was no cooperation with the US on this. Prime Minister at the time was Yitzhak Shamir. The US Secretary of the State at the time, James Baker, made 15 shuttle trips in the region, and after great pressure, accompanied by a refusal to give Israel guarantees for a loan it had requested of $11 billion, the well-known formula was reached, i.e., Palestinian representation within the framework of the Jordanian delegation. This conference did not result in any agreement, and it was dissolved after the Oslo Accords were reached under the government of Yitzhak Rabin. In this conflict of strategic interests, the US only succeeded in holding the conference after several major Palestinian concessions, the most important of which was the Palestinian not representing themselves with an independent delegation. It is clear what the symbolism of the Palestinian delegation being within the Jordanian delegation is, i.e., the Palestinians' place is in Jordan and not in Palestine. The other example, which was also had an opposing opinion, was the war on Iraq in 2003. Unlike the first war that the United States fought against Iraq in late 1991 and early 1992 to end the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, in which the United States had a strategic interest, namely the independence of Kuwait as a state, it had no strategic interest in wagging the second war, in 2003, especially in terms of its results. It has played a pivotal role in calling for the war and in preparing the internal atmosphere, especially since most of them were Zionists who were supporting Israel, especially that the U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney was one of its members. Dick Cheney was, in fact, the de facto president of the U.S. in terms of his influence. Netanyahu was very close to this group, even if he was not a prime minister at the time, but he was the head of a parliamentary bloc that was expected to return to power, as happened in 2009. I would like to remind you here that Israel's hostility towards Iraq is not new. As you know, Israel has bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. Israel's position is known from a strategic perspective, that is, it will not accept the presence of a strong state in the Middle East that is hostile to it. This position is still the same as we see now through its position from Iran. After it has become clear that the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a big lie used to incite war, the prevailing opinion in the US after the war and until now is that the war on Iraq was a big mistake. And no one in the mainstream media dared to talk clearly about Israel's war in the war and its supporters to the US. Despite that, the US has paid a heavy price for this war, as it has cost $1.1 trillion billion or $1,100 billion, in addition to the deaths of 4,500 soldiers and the wounding of 32,000. But what's more important from a strategic point of view is the growing influence of Iran in Iraq after the war. And this influence still exists till this day, politically and on the ground, which resulted in the launch of a number of marches from Iraq on Israel within the framework of what is known as the unity of arenas during the war of extermination against Gaza. I would like to add, as known, the United States has military bases in all the Arab Gulf states, and 2 other small bases were added to them during the proxy war on Syria. 2, one in the north, one in the south. In addition, and another small base in Jordan. If the United States was looking after its strategic interests in the region itself, and it goes its wars, then why does it need Israel? And if Israel is a strategic asset for the United States, in which most interests converge, why does the Zionist movement need this great effort that is making inside the United States and on more than one level to ensure that the policies of the United States regarding the Palestinian issue and other issues are in line with Israel's interests, if there is a convergence of interests in the first place? What is being neglected by the hypothesis of Israel as a strategic asset for the United States in the region is, first, the large organizational structure that the Zionist movement has worked on to build in the United States and European countries as well. And the extension of this structure in those societies, universities, and various communities, institutions, and all centers whose work has an impact on Israel. What is being neglected now are the facts, truths, and results achieved by this organizational structure. And examples are many, but not limited to making the accusation of anti-Semitism in the United States and major European countries in particular a deadly weapon used against its opponents. This is in addition to the ongoing efforts to influence the appointments in decision-making circles that affect Israel, especially in the US, including Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the diplomatic corps, advisors to the president, members of the National Security Council, and many other places. Most important of which is who runs the Congress in both, and who supports it, and who is campaigned against, and so on. Examples are many, and there's no space here to mention them all. The largest part of that is public information that a researcher who knows is looking for kind of thing. In case of the appointments in the Biden administration, for example, the two most important people in shaping the US positions on the war of annihilation are Secretary of State Blinken, whom we saw how he presented himself on his first visit to Israel after October 7th. That is, as he said, if you remember, he was coming here as a Jew, even though he was also holding the title of Secretary of State. And the other is Amos Hochstein, the special assistant, and who is now responsible for the file of Hezbollah and Lebanon on the one hand, and Israel on the other hand. So he was responsible for and he's a former soldier, and he is a special assistant to the president, and he is an Israeli and was born in Israel and a former soldier in the Israeli army. And no one dared to say that there could be a conflict of roles and a conflict of interests, at least in the case of Hochstein. At least it's worth noting that Blinken and Hochstein were the two people who gave the green light to Israel to expand the attack on Lebanon, according to one major news site. We have seen the same thing happens on previous occasions. For example, in the Camp David negotiations in July 2000, as the Zionist Dennis Ross wrote after the event for years, and Dennis Ross played a key role in the negotiations. And here I quote, he said, "We were Israel's lawyers in Camp David." I would add here that it is not possible to cram all or even most of what I've said so far into a general hypothesis that is different from what I have said and devoid of many details, tangible evidence, and available public information. It is not possible to cram all of this into a hypothesis of the type that influences the US policies in general, and in particular towards Israel, is something like major industries or bank capitals or the military industrial complex, and then to assume without credible evidence that the Zionist movement has its tireless work is basically in the interest of one or all of them, consciously or unconsciously. It is not clear that the big industries and banking capitals and the military industrial complex that prevented the US from taking a firm stance against the theft of land and settlement in the West Bank, or that it prevented the US from taking a supportive stance towards Security Council resolutions that would have been negative towards Israel had it not used the right of derogation, or that these big industries and capitals had prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state. Without detailed documented evidence showing how these interests prevented the US interests from putting any effective pressure on Israel because of these interests, unless all these remain views and on unsubstantial assumptions. Finally, I turn to the war of extermination, in which two sides came together: common interests between Israel and the US, and conflicting interests as well. I will not review all the stages of the war of extermination, but I will point out to two strategic issues as examples. I will begin by saying that it is clear that the US considers both Hamas and Hezbollah to be terrorists and want to end their military role just like Israel. This is what is common in terms of interests. However, at the beginning of the war, we saw the emergence of a question about Israel's plan for the day after, as I call it. Here is the strategic interests differ. That is not immediate or tactical interests, such as reducing the killing of civilians or allowing in humanitarian aid, but rather long-term interests related to the political map of the region. Secretary of State Blinken has stated more than once that Gaza will remain Palestinian territory, and the declared position of the Biden administration was for the Palestinian Authority to return to govern Gaza after it's rehabilitated. As for Netanyahu, he made his position very clear in his famous phrase, as you may remember, neither Hamas nor Fatah stand. He added early in the war that Israel would keep the security responsibility in its hands, which means reoccupying Gaza, or to be more precise, to keep it under occupation, because it's already occupied, because the sovereignty is in Israel's hands, borders, sea and air. And his position remains the same to this day. As for the second strategic issue, it's related to Iran. Throughout the stages of the war of extermination, it was the differences between the two parties were clear. Netanyahu sought to drag the US into war with Iran, and the Biden administration tried to avoid this in various ways, including an agreement with Iran after the assassination of Iranian leaders at the Iranian embassy in Damascus, that Iran's response would be limited, so that Israel would not respond in a way that would lead to a successive escalation that would end in a regional war that the US would be forced to enter. The reality is that the strategic interest was between the United States and Iran, as neither of them wanted a large-scale war in the region, and this position contradicted with the position of the current government in Israel. So whoever considers that the efforts of the US, Britain, and France to shoot down Iranian missiles in at least 2 stages is support for and protection of Israel, does not read the political map of the current conflict well, because the whole objective of this field intervention was to reduce the number and thus the impact of these missiles so that Israel would not escalate any response it took and the matter would develop into a regional war. What is true is that the Biden administration is a partner in the war of extermination in terms of supplying Israel with weapons and bombs that have so far killed at least 42,000 martyrs or more. Most of them are women and children. These are clear war crimes, although the tools to stop the war were in the hands of the Biden administration in terms of completely stopping military support. The reason for this is not strategic interest, but rather the position of the Congress, especially the Republican Party and more than half of the Democratic Party, who are captive to the Zionist lobbies and the Zionist capital that finances the campaigns of a number of candidates, especially in an election year, when political outbidding is the master of the situation. Finally, I will conclude with one sentence on another but related topic. I regret to inform you with the great sadness and sorrow of the bad news. And why do I apologize implicitly? It's related, though. I regret to inform you with great sadness and sorrow the absence of a single specialist in Palestinian universities, in American policies in general, domestic and foreign, and European policies as well, for countries that influence us in Palestine, and in the precise sense of specialization, to illuminate the path for us in this topic. I blame the administrations of Palestinian universities for this clear deficiency. May God reward greatly for your affection. And thank you.